Gracias. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, everybody, and warm welcome also to our colleagues from the Committee on the Honoring of Obligations and Commitments by the Member States of the Council of Europe, the Monitoring Committee, and the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons who are joining us today. Let me also excuse Damien Cotier, the chairman of our Legal and Human Rights Committee. He unfortunately cannot be with us due to parliamentary work back in Switzerland. Let me also remind you that this is a public hearing, that it will be broadcast on the Assembly's YouTube channel. Now, it's my pleasure to have by my side this morning the chairs of these two committees, Mr. Piero Fassino, the chairperson of the Monitoring Committee, and Mr. Theodoros Rousopoulos, the chairman of the Migration Committee. We are also fortunate today to have an excellent panel of experts, and I'm delighted to welcome them to our hearing. Mr. Thomas de Waal, the Senior Fellow of the Carnegie Europe, that will be joining us online. Mr. Andreas Wissner, the representative of the UNHCR representation to the European institutions in Strasbourg, and Professor Dr. Bjorn Schiffbauer, Professor of Public Law, European and International Law at the University of Rostock. As you know, our committee decided to have this joint public hearing with our other two committees. There is a turmoil today in the international order, but we cannot cease to pay attention to the difficult situation that was going on also with the Armenian population in Nagorno Karabakh. So the schedule is like this. We will start with the experts. Each of them will have around 15 minutes. Then our colleague, Piero Fassino, will open the floor for your comments and questions. And after that, Theodoros will give back the word to the experts for their reply. So let me start with Mr. Thomas de Waal. I don't know if he is already connected. He asked for the floor, just a second. And as soon as we can establish the online connection, we will start with his intervention. Yeah? No? There you go. Yeah. Mr. de Waal, please, your 15 minutes.
Good morning from London. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person. I'm hearing a little echo, but hopefully no, I think that has gone. And it's a great honor to be able to talk to the Assembly today, as you say, in this time of international turmoil, not least of which is the very sad situation in the South Caucasus. Let me begin with the September the 19th military assault by Azerbaijan on Nagorno Karabakh, which resulted in several hundred deaths, almost all of them military ones, but civilians also suffered. This military operation marked what I would call the formal end of the Armenian majority region known as Nagorno or Nagorny or Mountainous Karabakh, which has existed with that name as a territorial entity since 1923, and for many preceding centuries with other names. This is a human tragedy for its people. As you know, almost the entire Armenian population, more than 100,000 people, probably 99% of the people who were there on September the 18th, fled to Armenia following the military operation. Obviously, this conflict is very old. I've written about it for many years. It's had many phases, many twists and turns. Over the decades, unfortunately, force, not diplomacy, has always determined outcomes, with both Armenians and Azerbaijanis making facts on the ground through military operations. Over the years, there were also many difficult questions to the Armenian side. Since 1988, both Armenians and Azerbaijanis have used what can be qualified as ethnic cleansing, using force or the threat of force to drive members of the other community from their homes. So this latest round of violence is also one more tragic blow to prospects for peace and reconciliation in the South Caucasus. Now, I want to make the point that it's all the more tragic in my view because it could have been avoided, as active diplomacy was also underway. Since December 2021, there has been a serious Western-mediated diplomatic process, moderated by EU Council President Charles Michel, which deserved more investment from all sides, and in particular from Azerbaijan. It ran in parallel to negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan run by Moscow. In recent weeks, a dialogue had finally begun between the Armenians of Karabakh and representatives from Baku. This is something that many of us have been calling for years, but for years, Azerbaijan had refused to talk to the Armenians of Karabakh in any other format apart from as kind of domestic constituents of Azerbaijan. This new dialogue had finally begun, even despite the fact that Azerbaijan imposed a de facto blockade and closure of the Lachin corridor linking Armenia and Karabakh, imposing for many months, as we know, severe humanitarian suffering on the population of Karabakh for almost the entirety of this year. Time and patience was needed for this new process between the Karabakh Armenians and Baku to develop. Everyone, including finally the Karabakh Armenians themselves, understood that the final settlement of this conflict would occur within the framework of the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan. The only question was on what terms. So, being the actor in the most dominant position, President Ilham Aliyev had choices, but he chose to use force on September the 19th. This was also a breach of faith to Western leaders and their process, and cut off the dialogue process with the Karabakh Armenians. Although only a small number of Armenian civilians suffered violence, the overwhelming threat of force was, I would contend, enough to ensure that almost the entire population felt unsafe, felt in threat of persecution, and left Karabakh and their homes. We know that this Azerbaijan's military action was coordinated with Turkey. Although we do not know the details, we can also be fairly sure that it was coordinated also with Russia. This is because Russian peacekeepers were ordered to stand down in Karabakh themselves. They allowed the Azerbaijani forces to proceed, while media outlets in Moscow were instructed to blame Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan rather than Azerbaijan for the outbreak of violence. Subsequently, at United Nations, Moscow was much softer than Western countries in its characterization of this military operation by Azerbaijan. So this is the context within which Western engagement and engagement by bodies such as this with Armenia and Azerbaijan now takes place. In my view, it's time for a comprehensive reassessment from organizations such as this one. Azerbaijan is now proposing, and I'd like to devote a little time to this, is now proposing what it calls a reintegration agenda, under which Armenians can return to Karabakh and be Azerbaijani citizens. Let me note that Azerbaijan does not have dual citizenship, so Karabakhis who return would have to renounce their Armenian citizenship. I think that international bodies, such as the Council of Europe, must be very cautious about an initiative such as this. After all, we must begin by asking why this is happening. This initiative is only being offered only when 99% of the Karabakh Armenian population has fled, and not previously. I think this initiative needs to be seen within a broader framework of Azerbaijan's international commitments, and three broader issues, maybe more, but three broader issues need to be addressed. The first is Azerbaijan's record on minority populations in general. None of the minorities in Azerbaijan have any special political rights or autonomy provision. The languages of the two main minorities, the Talish and the Lezgin, are taught to just over 28,000 children in schools, according to Azerbaijan's own data from 2022. This is the main extent of their minority rights, and we're talking about substantial minority populations running into the hundreds of thousands. The opinion of the Advisory Committee of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities from 2017 noted a deteriorating human rights environment in Azerbaijan, pressure on minorities to demonstrate loyalty to the state, and, I quote, little space for expression of national minority identities in the public sphere, unquote. Several activists from minority communities, such as the Talish journalist Hilal Mamadov, are in prison. And so I would say that until Azerbaijani minorities in general have stronger legal protection and access to the rule of law, it is not feasible to imagine the integration of Armenians into Azerbaijani society. My second point is that, as many independent reports have confirmed, the Azerbaijani education system teaches children strongly negative and hate-provoking messages about Armenians as vandals, terrorists, and occupiers who committed genocide against Azerbaijan in the 1990s. I should also note in parenthesis that the Armenian education system does the same, though I would say without the same level of intensity. Without a wholesale reform of the national rhetoric about Armenians, as expressed through the education system, also the media and political discourse in general in Azerbaijan, I would say it's difficult to imagine Armenians feeling safe to live freely on Azerbaijani territory. Thirdly, any initiative such as this requires international scrutiny, and Azerbaijan's record on this is very poor. There have been many calls over the years to allow international fact-finding and monitoring missions to visit Nagorno Karabakh. Prior to 2020, some of these were rejected by the Armenians of Karabakh. More consistently, and especially since 2020, these proposals for the UN or other organizations to visit have been rejected by Azerbaijan, meaning that Nagorno-Karabakh remained a deeply isolated region, with the International Committee of the Red Cross the only international body on the ground. As you know too well, this assembly also called for a fact-finding mission to Karabakh in June during the blockade, but the call was rejected by Azerbaijan. I also note the international requests by cultural institutions to visit the site of the famous medieval Armenian cemetery in Julfa-Nakhchivan, which is widely reported to have been completely destroyed, have also been rejected. 2 US ambassadors to Baku who requested to visit the site of the cemetery were refused permission to do so. This also has implications for the fate of the substantial Armenian cultural heritage in Karabakh, which is now under full Azerbaijani control. I also have a few other comments. Just tell me how much time I have remaining.
You have about 2 to 3 minutes to wrap up.
Okay. Just briefly, let me, and we can return to this in the question and answer session. I would make the point that Azerbaijan also had a choice whether it wanted to see a strong Armenia, which would a partner country, which would be have a normalization with Turkey and be weaken its dependence on Russia, to strengthen regional cooperation in the South Caucasus, or a weaker Armenia, which had a closed border with Turkey, was more reliant on Russia, and was unstable. And I would contend that, unfortunately, Azerbaijan has opted for the second option, seems to be trying to weaken Armenia. This is, it's since the operation of September the 19th, it has kept up rhetoric about Azerbaijani exclaves inside Armenia as a territorial issue which needs peaceful resolution. It's kept up rhetoric about the so-called Zangezur corridor, a transport route to Nakhchivan. And most troubling, there's also rhetoric in Azerbaijan calling Armenia historic Azerbaijani territory, Western Azerbaijan, and demanding the right of return of Azerbaijanis who used to live in Armenia earlier in the 20th century. In my view, all these issues need a comprehensive approach. There are also many Armenians displaced from Azerbaijan in the last decades. The territorial issues need a very careful and long-term process, and the corridor needs an international dimension, whereas what we're hearing is more in the way of ultimatums from Azerbaijan or to Armenia. But this is obviously a complex subject. I'm sure I've left many issues and nuances out, but I'll stop there and I'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and certainly you will have time afterwards in the reply time, but now let us move on with the representative of the UNHCR, Mr. Andreas Wissner. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honor to be here with you. Let me just finish setting up my presentation that we have prepared to illustrate a few facts, especially regarding UNHCR's humanitarian response to the recent displacement situation. Okay. Following the recent escalation of this decade-long conflict in the region, the government of Armenia reported that between 24 September and 4 October, 100,632 refugees, including 30,000 children, arrived in Armenia. And that was an average of 15,000 people per day, with a peak of 40,000 on 27 September alone. So far, the government has registered more than 98,000 refugees in government-run registration centers, but the arrival has largely ceased as of the 1st of October. Overall, the number of new arrivals constitute now 3.3% of the entire Armenian population, which is just less than 3 million. That means 1 in 30 people are refugees and newly arrived refugees, which adds to Armenia's already pre-existing refugee population of around 35,000, most of them from the previous conflict in 2020. UNHCR has been on the ground from the beginning. We have an office there in Armenia since 1992, providing immediate assistance and assessing the situation of refugees' needs in support of the government-led response. The newly arrived refugees are mostly confused and very apprehensive about their future. They don't know what will happen to their homes that they have left and whether they will return there one day. They're anxious about what will happen to them now and worry about their children and whether they would have access to education. Most of them, because of the rush of their departure, they came with very few belongings and require urgent emergency assistance like blankets, bedding materials, medication, psychosocial support, and shelter in the immediate term. Many, including the children and elderly persons, are traumatized and in need of mental health and psychological support. Several are also worried about elderly family members who stayed behind as they were unable or unwilling to abandon their houses or even their animals that are very dear to many Armenians from Karabakh. Many refugees have a rural background who left behind their livestock, which is now left roaming around, risking to perish in the cold weather of the winter when it sets in. And similar applies also to many pets that had to be abandoned in the panic of departure for lack of transportation opportunities. The government of Armenia has been making consistent and commendable efforts to register the newly arrived and meet their rapidly growing needs. In support of this exemplary government-led response, UNHCR is leading the interagency refugee response, working with the resident coordinator's office, the other UN agencies and NGOs. There are sectoral working groups in place under which UNHCR is leading the one on the global one, intersectoral working group, and sectoral working groups on protection, shelter, and core relief items, non-food items. However, further support and funding from the international community is urgently needed. Therefore, to ensure more predictable funding, at least over the coming 6 months and hopefully beyond, a refugee response plan or emergency and resilience appeal was launched on 7 October. And as you see at a glance, some figures contained in that report, based on 136,000 refugees in Armenia, and also to be assisted 95,500 local persons assisting them. International communities appealing for $97 million for a total of, on behalf of a total of 16 partners, most of them local NGOs. This plan supports and complements the government response and aligns activities of all actors, which will also take into account the upcoming expected harsh winter months when critical support will be required. This response plan stresses that not only immediate emergency response needs, but also medium and long-term needs must be considered, which is typical in refugee situations like this one. Humanitarian assistance should be followed by progressive integration of refugees in national systems, which includes strengthening of public services. And finally, humanitarian assistance should merge into development assistance. so that it can be gradually phased out while national institutions are strengthened, especially in places that are mostly affected by refugee arrival. Maybe I can just introduce briefly a few of the sectors where UNHCR and the government are partnering to meet the most urgent needs, specifically with regard to registration. The government has done an exemplary job with some IT assistance from UNHCR. Then when we come to accommodation and assistance, which is one of UNHCR's specialties, there is an urgent need of a repair of existing shelters. The housing available for emergency accommodation is in short supply. So all these relief items that UNHCR and partners can provide are really most urgently needed at this stage, especially since many refugees had to be accommodated in remote areas where they're unlikely to find livelihood opportunities, but in remote areas far away from the capitals, empty houses were more likely to be available. But then assistance and relief items are all the more important to meet the basic needs of the people that have found shelter there. The government has in the meantime already received 58,000 requests for shelter support, and that need to be attended to in a joint effort. UNHCR is actively involved in protection monitoring at all locations where refugees are located. You see here on the map where the main distribution of refugees at this time. There's a trend for refugees to settle close to the capital, Yerevan, and also in a bit in the southern Syunik area. But really, where livelihood is available, refugees tend to move towards. So we also act in the mental health and psychological support sector, which is extremely important given the psychological condition of this population who have been uprooted all of a sudden and who have not really found a foothold really in their new host country. There is a plan under the response plan and it's already being done, to establish service points, child-friendly spaces, but also women and children centers, peer support networks to mitigate the impact of being displaced all of a sudden, the psychological impact. This is a rather traditional population. I've been told they are not so much interested in having psychological one-to-one support, but more in a mental health support, more on a community basis. So this is what is being put in place now together with the authorities. In terms of education, for the time being, 40% of the new arriving refugee children have already been enrolled, but this is not enough. This is a rather low enrollment because this is due to the population not having stabilized yet, as most are looking for opportunities, for livelihood opportunities in several locations before settling down more permanently. Cash-based assistance is an important element of the humanitarian relief effort. The government has recognized this as the most flexible modality to provide for immediate needs and has announced a one-time financial assistance for all refugees, including a 6-month rental subsidy. And this cash assistance should then slowly be transferred into national systems. So there's a need, of course, that refugees don't receive specific assistance, refugee assistance, for a long time, but they should be, as soon as possible, included into national social protection schemes. Finally, the refugee response plan also calls for long-term support. I'm not sure if this can be achieved in 6 months, but it has to be kept in mind from the beginning, the need to bring in international financial institutions and development actors to do things like upgrading schools and hospitals that cannot cope with the number of new users at this moment, and that need to be increased because people are likely to stay. I mean, it's 100,000 people who arrived, And our estimate is that at least 85,000 or so would probably see a longer-term perspective inside Armenia, whereas others also are likely to move on to abroad because many Armenians have relatives in the EU or in other countries. So there is also an expectation of a considerable secondary movement. But coming back to long-term efforts, it's really important that development actors are now mobilized with their bigger money. I mean, these appealed 98 million will not all be paid, and there's more money needed to build infrastructure facilities and to create real resilience in the local communities for the long-term support of this new population. And that, as I said at the beginning, makes up almost 3% of the Armenian population. It's really 1 out of 30 inhabitants. Imagine if this happened in a country like Germany or France all of a sudden, from 1 week to the other, basically. Now, there is you see a slide, and I think we can probably later distribute the presentation, and also you have access to this. There's a link to this refugee response plan, and that you can easily Google, and there's also a link on the presentation. Of course, you cannot click it from here. Maybe some population figures here. You see that most of the persons arrived are women, 30% are children, and you see an overview of the key figures here, how much is to be expended for how many refugees are to be assisted, and how many locals also who are hosting the newly arrived refugees and the ones that were already there. Here on this slide, you can see again the overall financial requirements and the number of agencies that are participating in the appeal, and how much money is actually being appealed for national, international NGOs and for UN agencies. It's not mentioned here explicitly. I think UNHCR alone is appealing for its own needs for some 14 million US dollars until next March. Here you can see on this slide, you can see a division of the different sectors, assistance sectors, protection, shelter, resilience, cash assistance. You see it's a big part of the response to support the government in providing sufficient means for refugees to sustain themselves. And cash assistance is, of course, the most flexible means of providing some dignified means of survival for refugees in a country such as Armenia. Now, let me turn to solutions. This is probably an issue that goes away now from the refugee response plan, but it's looking a little bit into the future. And here, allow me to quote our High Commissioner, Mr. Filippo Grandi, who stated just 2 days ago on 9 October at UNHCR's Executive Committee meeting in Geneva. And there's the quote, which you also see on the screen. He said, whenever time comes, UNHCR is ready to discuss solutions for the IDPs and the refugees with Armenia and Azerbaijan. UNHCR has actually been ready to do so since the origin of the situation in the 1990s.
You have 1 more minute.
As part of its mandate, UNHCR stands ready, therefore, to work on solutions, including return in safety and dignity, in compliance with human rights for all refugees and internally displaced persons. Peaceful settlement of conflicts is essential for UNHCR and other actors of the humanitarian community to engage in meaningful work and support implementation of durable solutions. Respect for human rights and confidence-building measures. What we do in repatriation operations often, for instance, are go-and-see visits in this context, are also important factors that help the work of UNHCR and the humanitarian community. UNHCR will be anxious to contribute to these efforts, disseminate good practices, and provide technical support to all parties. Thank you.
Thank you, and the Secretariat will be happy to distribute the presentation afterwards to colleagues or the link that you facilitated. Now let's continue with Dr. Bjorn Schiffbauer, Professor of Public Law, European and International Law at the University of Rostock. Dr. Schiffbauer, you have the floor.
Okay. Dear chairpersons, distinguished state representatives, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. Please allow me to focus only on some major aspects of international law, which are part of the bigger picture of international affairs. It remains undisputed that Nagorno Karabakh is part of the territory of Azerbaijan, and that therefore Azerbaijan has jurisdiction over this territory, including the individuals living there. However, Azerbaijan's sovereign rights apply only within the standards of international law, that is, treaty and customary law. In context with Nagorno Karabakh, there is no legal justification allowing Azerbaijan to ignore its obligations from international law. So, what are these obligations more specifically? As a consequence of international treaty law, states have to comply with decisions of international courts whose jurisdiction they have accepted. Two international courts have jurisdiction with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh and the right to make decisions binding upon Azerbaijan. The European Court of Human Rights, based on the European Convention on Human Rights, and the International Court of Justice, based on particular treaty law, here the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The European Court of Human Rights ordered interim measures on 21 December 2022 that Azerbaijan has to take all measures that are within their jurisdiction to ensure safe passage through the Lachin corridor. The International Court of Justice ordered, very similarly, provisional measures on 22nd of February 2023 and reaffirmed them on the 6th of July 2023. I quote, "The Republic of Azerbaijan shall take all measures in its disposal to ensure unimpeded movement of persons, vehicles, and cargo along the Lachin corridor in both directions." In the meantime, most individuals of the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh have left the territory and entered Armenia via the Lachin corridor. However, based on the information available, neither the supply of goods nor the passage of persons from Armenia back to Nagorno-Karabakh was and is assured by Azerbaijan. Thus, Azerbaijan does not comply, at least, with the in both direction requirement. These court decisions refer to the rights of the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. They are collectively protective under international law by the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. In addition, the Council of Europe Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities specifies certain rights in this context. Azerbaijan is a party to this treaty. The right of self-determination, as designated today, includes, to a certain degree, autonomous rights of independent organization within the legal order of the state having jurisdiction, that is, Azerbaijan. However, self-determination under international law does not imply a right to forceful secession or complete sovereignty, but this has not been seriously claimed either. Moreover, individuals of the ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh are protected by international human rights law as well as international humanitarian law. With respect to the ethnic Armenian population, international human rights law appears to be one of the most relevant legal areas, in particular, the European Convention on Human Rights. I will address this issue very briefly. Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to life. Article 3, the prohibition of torture, inhuman and degrading treatment. Article 6, the right to a fair trial. And Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, are most important with respect to the situation around the Lachin corridor. As long as the Lachin corridor was blocked by Azerbaijan, the population of Nagorno-Karabakh could not be supplied with food, medicine, energy, etc. This endangered many individual lives and was an inhuman treatment. Thus, Azerbaijan violated Article 2 and Article 3 of the Convention. since there was no way to judicial review of the situation. Article 6 was also violated. Finally, as long as individuals from Nagorno Karabakh could not pass the border to Armenia to visit their family members, Article 8 was violated in addition. Besides human rights law, aspects of international criminal law could also be relevant. By now, it at least cannot be excluded that several offenses of war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed by individuals from Azerbaijan. However, jurisdiction on these crimes is a different matter, and additionally, the crime of genocide, the crime of crimes, is a different matter too. Genocide is a particular international crime confirmed by the 1948 UN Genocide Convention, as well as by codifications of international criminal law, such as the Statute of the International Criminal Court. The duty to prevent genocide under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention addresses every state in the world and has the status of jus cogens. Moreover, Armenia and Azerbaijan are both parties to the Genocide Convention. The elements of genocide and related acts are listed in Articles 2 and 3 of the Genocide Convention. The ethnic Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh is an ethnic group and thus protected by Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. With regard to the Latin corridor, only Article 2c of the Genocide Convention may be pertinent. The Actus Reus says, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. However, the fact that the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh could use the Latin corridor in order to escape to Armenia is a strong indicator against the characteristic calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. This is only in terms of genocide, I have to stress. The group of the Armenian populations thus was not subject to physical destruction, but to social destruction by forced relocation. However, acts of so-called ethnic cleansing as such are not covered by the Genocide Convention and the crime of genocide. Another argument against genocide in this context is a genocide-related element of mens rea. This is the specific genocidal, I quote, intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. It is rather unlikely that actors from Azerbaijan intended to destroy the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, since these were merely subject to relocation. Please don't get me wrong, this is only in terms of genocide. So what can be concluded from all that in terms of international law in general? First, Azerbaijan continues to violate its specific international law obligation to ensure free passage through the Latin corridor in both directions. This runs parallel with the violation of the more general right of self-determination. Second, as a result of this violation, Azerbaijan is responsible for human rights violations against individuals of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh under Articles 2, 3, 6, and 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Third, aspects of international criminal law need to be further assessed. Fourth, genocide has rather not been committed against the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. After all, the lens that focuses international law is not crystal clear, but clear enough to determine that Azerbaijan is responsible for several serious violations of international law. They all have in common that the Latin corridor is not kept open in both directions to safeguard collective and individual rights of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Schiffbauer, and thank you for providing us with your legal analysis. Adesso lascio la parola all'onorevole Piero Fassina.
Merci, merci. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to thank all our experts and speakers. I'd like to thank you for coming to take part in this joint hearing. There are so many of you who've come here. let's start the debate, and let's start the debate by giving the floor to Mr. Hodukovic, who's our rapporteur for the debate that's going to be held on this matter that we're dealing with now. Mr. Hodukovic, you have the floor. Now, there are a lot of people that wish to speak. Please, can you ensure that your speaking time is restricted to 3 to 4 minutes, no more than that?
Well,
Mr. Dukovic.
thank you, Mr. Fassino. I will not take a lot of time. I actually want to hear more from my colleagues and then a reply by the speakers. I just wanted to thank the speakers for this valuable input. Some of your theses and some of your interventions also actually, sorry, corroborate the info we have used in preparing this report. In all honesty, we have also heard a lot of encouraging things from the Azerbaijani side about the steps that are taken to ensure the return of the Armenian population. I hope that with the access of international organization, as well as our organization, Parliamentary Assembly, and other institutions like Commission of Human Rights and General Secretary, we will be able to corroborate this information. In any case, the situation now is worrying. I think as an institution, we need to take a stand and help to resolve the situation in the sense that we ensure that all people who want to return are returned, that they are extended protection of the Azerbaijani constitution as they are Armenians living on Azerbaijan territory. And as such that we know that there is full cooperation in both countries, especially in Azerbaijan, since we're debating its territory now, with respect to these issues. Well, without further ado, I wish to thank you once again. Your input has been very valuable. I have listened very carefully and took notes, and surely I will use some of this in my debate in the hemicycle as well. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hodukovic. Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Christofferson. She's a co-rapporteur on Azerbaijan. You have the floor.
Vous avez la parole, Madame Christophers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the experts for providing us with correct and balanced information. It's difficult to assess everything in such a conflict, and our task as rapporteurs is to be balanced. For the time being, it seems like the situation in Nagorno Karabakh actually is taken out of our hands as rapporteurs, because it's been lifted to a higher level in the Council of Europe and to the Parliamentary Assembly. But as co-rapporteurs, we intend to go to Azerbaijan in November and then mainly focus on the human rights situation within Azerbaijan. And in our report, which we hope to introduce to the Parliamentary Assembly in January, we will refer to what's going to take place in the Parliamentary Assembly today and and the outcome of the two, hopefully two delegations from the Council of Europe to the area Nagorno Karabakh. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Let me now give the floor to Mrs. Harberg. She's a rapporteur for Armenia. You have the floor. Microphone, please.
Sorry, I haven't asked about the floor. Do you want me to say something, or I just listen to the other interventions? Thank you.
Alors, à ce point,
Okay. In that case, we're going to open up the debate. There are a number of people that have indicated they'd like to take the floor. So I'm going to ask each of you to please restrict yourselves to 2 to 3 minutes speaking time. Mr. Bogdan, please.
Thank you.
Paul Gavin, sorry.
My question is to Thomas de Waal, and it relates to the possibilities that we all hope to see the Armenian population return to Nagorno Karabakh. I want to ask Mr. de Waal, is the elephant in the room the really appalling human rights record of the Azerbaijani regime, which has been well documented by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, and indeed by this organization? If there isn't freedom of association, if there's systemic torture, if there's crushing of peaceful protests, which has all been documented by these organizations, if this is how the Azerbaijani population is treated by the Aliyev regime, what hope is there for the Armenian population returning unless there is true international supervision allowed? Thank you.
Thank you. Tabadanian, please.
I have a question to Mr. Schiffbauer. Mr. Schiffbauer, you're addressing the Corpus Delicti of the Genocide Convention. I would like to ask you the following question. When you're addressing the actus reus of Article 2.c of the Genocide Convention, creation of the certain conditions, whether you also taking into account the contextual element which was prescribed in the element of the crimes, in the ICC statute, for example, and in other documents, because look at the patterns. Genocide is not a crime intended to kill everybody. It is intended to kill the identity, and you should agree with this. So the problem is the following. When we started this discussion, Nagorno-Karabakh was under the siege. There have been no food, no medicine, and so on. From this perspective, I would like you to qualify the events, because it was prohibited to enter any kind of food and medicine in the territory populated totally by Armenians. And this is a very important question. Plus, if you challenging the fact of it may have certain elements of the crime of genocide, I would like you to be more, profoundly address the issue of presence of the corpus delicti of the crimes against humanity, of persecution, and crimes against humanity of deportation. Actually, I read some of your publication. I understand that you are very well familiar with all these developments, and I would like to more precise answer on these questions. Thank you.
Mr. Pierre Fride, please. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking in French. I'd like, first of all, to thank the different experts that have come to this hearing, and they've described a situation that seems like a straightforward truth with regard to the Lachin corridor, what's being organized and what's trying to be done to improve things. Now, I'd like to look back to the history of the conflict between both countries. In 2020, I was the chair of the Migration Committee, and with my friend Paul Gavin, we had a debate that was organized on the humanitarian situation following the 2020 conflict. I'd just like to ask you what the latest state of play is with regard to the war prisoners that were taken at the time. Have things been sorted out since then? Because we didn't have any clear answer. We were told, well, they're not prisoners of war, they're terrorists, because they were caught with firearms, and even though a ceasefire had been declared, and there was sort of a lack of a will on the part of the Azeris to resolve this and to de-escalate tensions. And I just wanted to ask you, this is still a major situation you're having to deal with. Thank you.
Mr. Seydov.
Mr. Seydov.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm not so surprised to hear this unilateral approach to the situation in our region. Despite of the fact that we have sent a lot of letters, a lot of information about what is really going on, unfortunately, we can see exactly the opposite attitudes toward the situation in the region. And I'm really very disappointed with presentation of Mr. Thomas de Waal, because this expert knows much better than others what is really going on. But what he said, first of all, he said that Azerbaijan refused to communicate with Armenians before this military operation. This is absolutely wrong information. We several times asked Armenians to come together, to sit together and to discuss. They refused that. He didn't mention even one word about the reasons of this operation. He didn't say that Azerbaijanis, more than 300 Azerbaijanis have been killed before the military operation. And he didn't say that Azerbaijan has already done a lot for Armenians who are living in Karabakh. And we open the electronic portal for registration Armenians who willing to return back to Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is doing its best for peace in the region, but unfortunately, yesterday, Mr. Pashinyan refused to sit together with my president and to continue peaceful negotiations about the situation in the region. That's why I ask Mr. Thomas de Waal to be objective and to take into account the facts that national minorities in Azerbaijan, they are living in peace and harmony. And the vivid example of that, that's a Jewish minority, which living in harmony with Azerbaijanis. Talish and Lezgin minority also. And his examples is an not adequate example for these discussions. And that's why I ask Mr. Thomas de Waal to take into account the realities, not to follow the propaganda and not to be an objective, being an expert to international institution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rustinyan, please. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Colleagues. Well, I think the situation is very clear. Following the complete blockade of 10 months and following the war triggered by Azerbaijan against the people of Nagorno Karabakh, the entire population of Nagorno Karabakh has had to leave their homes where they've been living for centuries. This is simply a typical example of ethnic cleansing, because so many people do not leave their homes on their own free will. We also know that ethnic cleansing is considered as one of the acts of a genocide. So this is basically a very serious violation of the commitments undertaken by Azerbaijan, and sanctions should be imposed.
Next speaker, Mr. Yafarov.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to start my speech with the conclusion that reintegration of ethnic Armenians is not a one-way ticket. All of us has equal rights before the law. So when we talk about the rights of the Karabakh Armenians, we need also to talk about the Azerbaijani refugees from Armenia. Therefore, today I am addressing all of you as a special representative of the Western Azerbaijan community. And the Western Azerbaijan community is an NGO established in 1989 and renamed itself based on the... You can't point of order me while I'm speaking after. No. All of you...
Per favore. Excusez-moi. Excuse me. Everyone has the right to say their piece. It's a debate. It's a debate and a discussion.
And all of you wonder why I represent the Western Azerbaijan community, because my father and my mother and my brother, they all were born in the Basarkecha region of the Armenia. It's in the south of the Lake Göce. Year before a general meeting of the Western Azerbaijan community, which I attended as an observer, my father and the senior community members asked me to be a special representative on the international issues. And they entrusted me with this power. Their desire and devotion to go back homeland, Armenia, is unbelievable, and they want to go back altogether. They want to live in under constitution of the Armenia, and they want to be a citizen of Armenia. I understand their attachment to home, but I don't have a capacity to comprehend it. For example, I understand, but I couldn't comprehend why my father and my mother cried when they saw some recent footage of their home, which was just 7 and 10 meters square. My father is over the age of 60, and same as my mother. They studied in Armenian school together. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was a school director in Armenia. And after they were expelled, forced to leave, and ethnically cleansed by Armenian government, which was well established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1993 resolution, which was adopted on 20th December with reference 14th December meeting of the EXCOM UNHCR. Azerbaijan government hosted us for over 30 years. To such level, even the son of refugee, me, elected as MP in Azerbaijan. My father had a good life in Azerbaijan. He's a very accomplished person, but I couldn't comprehend why he cried over for his home, which is 710 square meters. Later, he told me that he built this house together with his father. So after he marries my mother, they could move in. So unfortunately, before they move in, my grandfather died. They were only live there for some months. My father told me that he doesn't know whether he will see that he will go back or not, but he's sure that time will come, we will coexist together with Armenia in the same community I used to before. But he told me that when we coexist together, when we return, he asked me, he told me that where his father's grave and his grandfather's grave, so to restore it and to take care of it. Now I am addressing the panelists. Do you believe in the equal rights before the law? Do you recognize our right to return of the Western Azerbaijan community? If yes, then when? Do you think that reintegration should be one way? Do you think that some ethnic groups have priority in international law? Do you think that some religions have priority? Thank you.
Next speaker, Mr. Gardili.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to express my gratitude to all experts, no matter whether we disagree or agree. This is a free debate, so I'm grateful to everyone who made their presentation. Since I'm a lawyer myself, I would like to talk more on legal aspects of this problem. And from what I hear from you, there are certain issues that I cannot agree respectfully. First of all, you said that secession wasn't seriously claimed. And this is not just my opinion. This is the series of facts that Armenians in Karabakh several times, many times, in fact, during the Soviet Union, but successfully and at the very end of the Soviet era, they did claim secession from Azerbaijan. They had the decision of the, at that time, Nagorno Karabakh Oblast Soviet Council, that's how it was called. And they decided to separate from Azerbaijan and unite it with Armenia. This is a fact, those acts exist. And then they held a referendum in December in 1991, claiming independence from Azerbaijan. Then they started claiming that they never were part of Azerbaijan, neither before Soviet Union nor after Soviet Union. So there were a series of acts and deeds by the Karabakh Armenians, which proves that they did have a serious intention to secede. So that's just a comment. Then self-determination, as the right to self-determination does not by itself oblige states to give autonomy to any part of its territories. You all come from different countries. In some of your countries, there are autonomies. In some of your countries, they are not. It's the fact that autonomy exists in one country, doesn't exist in another one, is more a historical fact or a cultural context rather than legal claim. And of course, self-determination, the right to self-determination are possessed by peoples, not by ethnic minorities. I would like to remind you that back in the 90s, I think it was 1994, that Norwegian professor Björn Baade was entrusted by the General Assembly of the United Nations to prepare a report on the definition of a people. There was one question put before them as Björn Baade: what constitutes a people? And as Björn Baade considered many cases, including Karabakh, and he wrote in his report that Armenians in Karabakh are not people, they are ethnic minorities. He went even as far as to say that, for example, Armenians in France and in America, in the United States, are not ethnic minorities, because he invented the term mother country, because they do not have historical links with mother country. But Armenians in Azerbaijan are ethnic minorities because they do have such a link. So this is also a moral legal concept. And Karabakh recently, yes, for 30 years, consisted only of Armenians, because Armenians in Karabakh themselves committed ethnic cleansings.
Time.
Why 1 minute?
Time.
Yes, I'm finalizing. So Karabakh the population of Karabakh was consisted of Armenians. This fact should not be taken for granted, because the context is there were Azerbaijanis living in Karabakh, but they were all expelled even before the active war started. So these are just the reminder for everyone. This is the context. Before you come to any conclusion, please consider this. And also the claims with regard to violation of certain human rights of ethnic minorities are just an opinion, which I do respect, but I disagree. Thank you very much.
Next speaker, Mrs. Arpadarai.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you for your thoughts, dear experts. My question is to Mr. Thomas de Waal. Well, there are serious claims that Mr. de Waal was working with Ruben Vardanyan, who is a money launderer, very known person. He was hired by Mr. Vardanyan. There are reasonable doubts in that, and he is the person from sanctions list in Ukraine. So I don't know whether he can be an expert here, because he is. If he works for the Armenian side, which again, I'm saying that there are doubts and serious claims on that, he cannot be expert. But again, the one thing that Mr. de Waal didn't mention is that why it all started. Mr. de Waal didn't mention that Azerbaijan doesn't have a record of ethnic cleansing. It is Armenia that has ethnically cleansed 1 million Azerbaijanis. Not only Armenia occupied Karabakh and surrounding regions and ethnically cleansed Armenia. The argument of Armenian side was always that we have ethnically cleansed Azerbaijanis because of the potential genocide. And the ideology was incompatibility of Armenians and Azerbaijanis. And this is not a sarcasm, dear colleagues. This was stated by their former president, that Azerbaijanis and Armenians cannot live together. For 30 years, they've been communicating it. For 30 years, propaganda, diaspora, politicians, experts, they've been trying to brainwash Armenians, saying that you cannot live with Azerbaijanis. And this is the result why Armenians actually left from Karabakh, because they are afraid because of this propaganda that was mentioned. Azerbaijan doesn't have a record of ethnic cleansing. Armenia does. Armenia is the only mono-ethnic country in our region. So these are the facts. And Mr. de Waal knows that better than anyone. Also about Lachin corridor, the colleagues mentioned here that Azerbaijan is obliged to give some passage, free passage through Lachin corridor. Well, Lachin border post control is one of the border posts of Azerbaijani Republic. And there are rules, migration rules, border post rules, and everything. And it is Azerbaijani constitution, Azerbaijani laws regulated. Neither trilateral statement nor any other document have given exterritoriality status to this road. The rules still apply. We said that it is open for humanitarian, for civilians and cargos, but we didn't say that it will be open for Armenian militants, for Armenian weapons and ammunitions. For 3 years, this road was violated by Armenian side. We've been saying many times in this assembly that Armenia is violating this road. We see that. We have the evidence that they are bringing munitions to our territory. We also had evidence that Armenia had 10,000 militants on Azerbaijani soil in Karabakh. That was the reason that Azerbaijan started anti-terror actions. But I don't know why Mr. de Waal didn't mention all of that. Thank you.
Mr. Rubinian, excuse me. Rubinian.
Thank you. Thank you, dear colleagues. I think by now it all is clear. Azerbaijan had a clear intent to ethnically cleanse the Armenians of Nagorno Karabakh, and they did ethnically cleanse the Armenians of Nagorno Karabakh. But what is astonishing in this discussion is the level of cynicism of our Azerbaijani colleagues, who have become mere advocates of their authoritarian genocidal regime. They are claiming that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are Azerbaijani citizens and Azerbaijan is this multicultural heaven on earth. Did you notice that none of them uttered a single word about the fate of these 100,000 Armenians? None of them talked about what needs they will have. No one had some condolences for the people who have died, condolences for the people who have been separated from their families, nothing. But if we take into account that it was the clear intent of the regime they are representatives of to get rid of these Armenians, everything becomes logical. But this is not all. Why I was wanting to have a point of order, to reply to Mr. Yafarov. These people are so devoid of shame that even after ethnically cleansing an entire population just a couple of weeks ago, they come to this organization and call Armenia Western Azerbaijan. If you haven't noticed, he called Armenia Western Azerbaijan. Dear colleagues, I think, don't interrupt me and stay silent. I think you don't have to be a genius to understand that the recent actions of Azerbaijan, including the war waged in 2020, including the recent ethnic cleansing, including all these irredentist talks about demanding from Armenian an extraterritorial corridor or not recognizing Armenia's borders, and including them coming here and talking about Armenia and naming it Western Azerbaijan, you don't have to be a genius to understand that Azerbaijan has become a threat to international order, international law. And this regime has to be punished by law, of course. And we, as the Armenian delegation, as the Republic of Armenia, we expect the support of the international community, of you, of each of you personally, because this is not about Armenia only. This is about international order and international law. And dear chairs, I kindly ask you not to allow anyone here to use irredentist, aggressive terms. It is not acceptable to call the territory of Armenia Western Azerbaijan. I think I don't need to explain why. Thank you.
Mr. Molazada.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. It's really strange for me that a representative of the UNHCR didn't mention 1 million Azerbaijani refugees. They became refugees after brutal ethnic cleansing. Just would like to remind to Mr. Thomas de Waal, he wrote about it in his book, Hojali massacre, when one night 600 children were burned and killed. But it's okay. Refugees could not return back to Karabakh because of the situation regarding of 1 million mines which planted in Karabakh. Every day, civil people dying of these mines. And also, Lachin Road, which we agreed after trilateral statement and ceasefire, was used delivering new mines. And there are a lot of facts that Armenian militaries who didn't leave territory according to trilateral statement. Russian peacekeepers came, but Armenia has 10,000 military who continue planting mines, continue killing civil people who are trying to return back to Karabakh. There were a lot of facts about that, but it's a pity that UN organization did not mention about the new victims who was before these anti-terror actions. And also, very important for all of us to think about the building a real measures of confidence building. We should work on that, but what we have new wave of hatred. A lot of problem regarding to who push out this Armenian population links to domestic political situation in Armenia, where Karabakh clans, brutal clans, which had a lot of military crimes, trying to return back to power, using refugees, using also some military links to them. just have a coup d'etat in Armenia. A lot of problem regarding to Armenian domestic situation. And one of the other problem, Armenian authorities never kept their words. They said yes in Washington, they said yes in Brussels, then returned back, ran to Moscow and cancel all agreements. How to work, how to deal with them if they're afraid of their own situation in Armenia. There is a military opposition in Armenia. There are Armenian militaries in Azerbaijani territory, and they links to each other. I believe that we should also think about the crimes of military criminals. We should again look to them. They killed children, women. They did the same what we had in Ukraine. That's why I believe international organization should create tribunal about military criminals who now trying to come back.
Monsieur Vardanian, il faut terminer.
Mr. Vadanyan, so you're going to have to wrap up because we do need to pass on the floor to our experts. So perhaps the last two speakers, Mr. Vadanyan and Mr. Loukaides, would kindly abide by their speaking time. So do not go beyond 3 minutes. Mr. Vadanyan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to be short. I would address to representatives here we have of Monaco, San Marino, and Liechtenstein. Imagine, if you can, that in one day, a bigger power decided to organize an exodus. In Nagorno Karabakh, we have population more than in 3 mentioned countries. But the piteous thing that when we have started to discuss, to initiate this discussion in the legal committee, I urge to all my colleagues that, ladies and gentlemen, we are next door to ethnic cleansing. And initially, this discussion was organized to stop this ethnic cleansing, stop the exodus. Now we are in a situation when the exodus happened, and we have very cynical points of view from the authoritarian regime about the fact that they just decided to leave suddenly. That's why I would like to request our experts, and especially Mr. Schiffbauer, take into account in your final remarks all the speeches of racist nature which have been done during this discussion by our Azerbaijani colleagues. We should take into account very important fact, even today, even in these circumstances, that the Council of Europe actually speaking about the very tough sanctions against Azerbaijan, Azerbaijani authorities trying to push us in any way. And this is non-interconnected with the international law. Mr. Jafarov started read his biography. May I start to read my biography? From my family's biography from the end of 19th century, from the Armenian genocide. Should I speak about Van, Bitlis, and so on? We do not do this. We are speaking about today. And the worst thing, Mr. Jafarov, being a president, I'm finishing, being a president of the subcommittee on human rights, do not address the human rights, because 100,000 people became victims of internationally wrongful act of crimes against humanity. And I would like you to address this issue. Thank
you. Mr. Loukaides.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we have been discussing this issue, and I have to remind ourselves, last June in this assembly, and we had an excellent report and a resolution speaking about the grave possibility and imminent danger to have an ethnic cleansing in Nagorno Karabakh. I have to remind the members of the Monitoring Committee that we have been discussing the very same issue just a few days before the military attack of Azerbaijan in the presence of the European Commission. And we have been warning that things should be done in order to avoid an ethnic cleansing, because it was so obvious that it was coming. And unfortunately, 10 days later, after our meeting in Paris, it came. We are talking about one more failure of the international system, of the international order, of our organizations, including our organization, EU, UN, and not only. And what we have to discuss now is the need not to have any more violations of international law in the area, in this turbulent area as well. And we have to be very strict and consistent when dealing with these issues. I'm a refugee myself, a displaced person. So I'm very sensitive when we're talking about refugees and displaced persons, whenever we speak about the Ukrainian refugees, whenever we speak about the Syrian refugees, but now we're talking about a disaster in relation with Nagorno Karabakh. This is our issue now. And what we have to discuss, as Karabakh, as Azerbaijan has a very bad record on the protection of human rights inside the country, unfortunately, and it is behaving as it is behaving against its neighbors, we think that we should discuss and be consistent in the same way that we have done in similar cases. This is my strong opinion.
Dernière intervention.
So last speaker, Mr. Saidov.
Mr. Chairman, I will be very brief. I ask my Armenian colleagues to refrain from these hate rhetorics. I ask them to understand that with this kind of approach, they could create much more problems for the Council of Europe and for understanding the reality than Council of Europe unfortunately have. Yes, some colleagues have already mentioned that this is really disaster, but disaster is that for resolution didn't implement it for 30 years of period of time. Disaster that this assembly didn't mention and didn't pay attention to the illegal elections of the president of so-called Nagorno Karabakh. And disaster that this organization is thinking about the results, about the situation, but we should look deeper into the roots of this problem, into the reasons why it's happened, because of absence of attention to the 1 million refugees, to the Khojaly massacre, to the situation in the region, to the Azerbaijan which had been occupied for 30 years. This is the real reasons. And that's why to present Azerbaijan in a bad way, that's another one mistake which could this assembly done. I ask to refrain from that. Thank you.
Merci à tous les collègues.
Well, thank you to all of our colleagues. I'll give the floor to President Avramopoulos.
Thank you, Mr. Fassino. Dear colleagues, allow me to say a few words. Between yesterday and today, yesterday's history, today we can change or we can write history. Must be present the willingness to do things, to change things. We have heard both sides. We have had a lot of interesting information. We have had analysis. And I think that this will help us in our today's meeting, especially later in the plenary. I will give now, in reverse order, the floor to the speakers. Mr. Schiffbauer, you will speak first.
Thank you very much. I take into account every contribution, and I'm very thankful for them. And I notice that I have received opposition from both sides in the room. And well, as a lawyer, to receive opposition from both sides sometimes is an indicator of well-balanced arguments. And I really appreciate the contributions to continue to substantiate my legal arguments on the situations. When it comes to genocide, there were one or two interventions that doubted my legal assessment on genocide. I have to clarify that social genocide, as it was mentioned in the room, can be covered by the Genocide Convention. It is disputed, it is not crystal clear. Legal scholars dispute about that, but social genocide, to destroy a social group as such, still needs to destroy the element of destruction within the group, and mere relocation of a group still does not result as such in a social destruction of a group in terms of genocide. And this is for theological reasons very true, because genocide as the crime of crime is to be interpreted restrictively, not to open the door for misuse, for abuse, as we can notice the abuse of the term of genocide in other regions of the world. You know what I mean. But on the other hand, this does not exclude the commission of criminal offenses covered and to be punished under international law. So there's still war crimes, there's still crimes against humanity, and I, with no words, want to be understood that I exclude the commission of crimes against humanity and war crimes. Ethnic cleansing as such is not a legal term, but what we know or understand by ethnic cleansing can be taken as a matter of fact to assess whether crimes against humanity, relocation, deportation, let me refer to the ICC statute, deportation and forcible transfer of population. This is most probably the case in the situation in Nagorno Karabakh. But there is still a problem of jurisdiction on this offense, because neither Azerbaijan nor Armenia are parties to the ICC statute. So you now ratified it, you now. Okay. So then there is my legal advice would be to take over the situation to the prosecutor. And what is more, I heard also claims from the side of Azerbaijan that there, and I think there is some reason to further assess these claims also, that there has been committed international crimes against Azerbaijani population. I did not exclude that with any word, but this is a different thing. This is not a matter to the situation in Nagorno Karabakh today, for two reasons. First, this is no legal justification for the current situation. Yeah, this is a different topic, a different in temporal topic as well. And second, if you ask for a criminal prosecution, then please, I'm on the side of international law. I don't demand anything to you. Yeah, but in terms of international law, I would recommend to hand over the situation to the ICC as well. And that would be, for my opinion, because I'm not on the side of Azerbaijan, nor on the side of Armenia, but on the side of international law, that would be a way for balancing under international law the situation from both perspectives, from Azerbaijan and from Armenia. But going back to the situation of Nagorno Karabakh, there's still the factual situation that the population from Nagorno Karabakh had to escape to Armenia in order to escape from death. And this remains to the responsibility of Azerbaijan, and this is still a violation of a grave violation of human rights. And I recommend, from a legal point of view, to the Assembly to react to that under the terms of international law by the means the Council of Europe has. But this is only to the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh. I do not doubt any crimes, any international wrongful acts against Azerbaijani population in different situations. This is a different thing, and this is not a justification for the situation right now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Schiffbauer. Mr. Wissner, Andreas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick response to, I think UNHCR's presentation was arguably the least contentious one, because UNHCR is in the region to provide humanitarian assistance, which is really something that no one will object to 100,000 persons who have just been displaced 2 weeks ago and were facing a very difficult situation and despair. So I wanted just to clarify a remark from Mr. Mulazadeh, who had said that UNHCR wasn't mentioning the Azerbaijani displacement when talking about humanitarian assistance mainly that needs to be provided in the current emergency situation. I mean, there is no more emergency in view of the displacement of Azerbaijani persons from Karabakh 30 years ago, fortunately, but it's not forgotten. And that's why I would like to come back to the quotation from our High Commissioner Filippo Grandi 2 days ago, talking about durable solutions to the situation. He is very careful in saying when time comes, UNHCR is ready to discuss solutions for the IDPs, meaning persons displaced mainly inside Azerbaijan, even those 30 years ago, and the refugees with Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, and UNHCR has been ready to discuss these solutions since 30 years ago. And we have representations in both countries, equal representations, trying to engage with both sides for achievement of durable solutions. But we haven't been successful in doing so so far. But UNHCR has no mandate to establish political peace. So he said, our High Commissioner, whenever time comes for that, we need trust and confidence building between the parties. We need, before UNHCR can offer its good services on the ground and establish any return operations in agreement with all parties, we need the parties to sort out their conflict to an extent so that UNHCR can start facilitating sustainable returns. And we hope that this will soon be the case. And as I said, UNHCR is anxious to contribute its internationally good practices by means of organizing go-and-see visits and other trust and confidence building measures at the local scale once there is a global agreement on the terms and conditions of more lasting peace among the political parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. I will now ask Mr. de Waal. Is Mr. de Waal with us? Mr. de Waal, if you are listening, ask for the floor. Okay.
Yes,
the
thank
floor is
you.
yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many points have been raised. I'll try to deal with all of them. First of all, I briefly addressed.
Could you please switch to the floor? Switch to the floor and not listen to the interpreting channels.
I'm surprised that she brought up this allegation in some Azerbaijani media that I was working for Mr. Ruben Vardinian. This is completely false. I've never worked with or for Mr. Ruben Vardinian. There was also a reference in that unprofessional media report to the Carnegie Foundation. There is no such thing as a Carnegie Foundation, but Andrew Carnegie founded many organizations, dozens of them over the years in the early 20th century, and it may be a reference to one other Carnegie Foundation. So I'm surprised that she brings it up, this up in this assembly. Mr. Saidov talks about contacts with the Baku and the Karabakh Armenians. I was trying to be careful in my remarks. There were indeed contacts this year, which was positive. My point was that there were no contacts up until 2023. There was almost 30 years, I would say, wasted in which there were no direct talks between Baku and the Karabakh Armenians, no talks at all. They started this year. They were disrupted several times. It's my information that there were some confidential talks even in September, that they were intensifying in the town of Shusha between Baku representatives and the Karabakh Armenians. And that raises a serious question as to why, when those talks had started, Baku then resorted to military force. And that really was my point. The big question of national minorities in Azerbaijan, I think Mr. Gavin makes the extremely important point that the rule of law and human rights situation in Azerbaijan generally is very poor. And therefore, Azerbaijani citizens generally don't have proper recourse to justice. When it comes to national minorities, there are indeed cultural and educational rights, which is positive, but it doesn't really extend beyond that. There are very few political rights given to minorities in Azerbaijan. And obviously, there's a specific problem with regard to Armenians who've been subject to hate speech over the years. Let me just quote you. There's an article in the Guardian newspaper on the 9th of October, which I recommend, from an Azerbaijani former IDP calling for reconciliation with Armenians, saying that he does not want this cycle of ethnic cleansing and hatred to continue. And he said that the president took power in 2003 and curtailed free speech in Azerbaijan, with the notable exception of hate speech against the Armenians. And I think this comes from an Azerbaijani commentator living now in exile. And I think this is indeed a real severe problem. Let me also remind you that prior to 2020 war, President Aliyev had promised the Karabakh Armenians, I quote, the highest autonomy in the world. And then after the 2020 war, he said they had missed their chance and their autonomy had, quote, gone to hell. And so this, again, is the context in which the Karabakh Armenians are being offered some kind of deal to integrate into Azerbaijan. A lot of historical questions. I've written extensively about this over the years. This goes back to the breakup of the Russian Empire in the early 20th century, when this was a mixed region of Armenians and Azerbaijanis. What's now the Azerbaijani region of Nakhchivan has been for 100 years. In the early 20th century had a 40% Armenian population. The region called Zangezur or Sunik had a substantial Azerbaijani population. This is what Mr. Jafarov is referring to. There was mass flight in the early 20th century, even more mass flight in the late Soviet period when Azerbaijanis left Armenia, but also, hasn't been mentioned today, 200,000 Armenians lived in Baku, the city of Baku, and all of them fled under threat of violence in 1990 and from other Azerbaijani cities. So what's needed is not a selective but a comprehensive approach, I think, to the right of return. Right of return, I think, is a right but not an obligation. It should be a comprehensive approach, not a selective one. And this, I think, it is part of the search for justice in this conflict, which has seen much injustice, and violence. I would also caution against the figure of 1 million refugees or IDPs. You can read the appendix in my book, Black Garden. It was a large number. It was probably 600,000. It wasn't 1 million refugees. So caution against the use of inflated figures, which does not help a reckoning in this conflict. Let me just close by saying a couple of words about the justice issues. Certainly many war crimes have been committed since the late 1980s by both sides. And there's definitely a feeling of impunity around this conflict, and no one has been properly punished. We shouldn't be encouraging victors' justice from the side of Azerbaijan. I think we should be encouraging a comprehensive approach in which there's much data and evidence about this. There should be a comprehensive approach to the justice issue. I think it's very positive that Armenia has now joining the International Criminal Court. I think this is a step forward, but obviously Azerbaijan is not a member, and this would be a question to the Azerbaijani members here today. Would they encourage their government to join the International Criminal Court so that there's a comprehensive approach to the justice and impunity issue? Thank you again for inviting me. I hope I've been able to contribute positively to your discussion.
Thank you, Mr. de Waal. I want to thank our honorable guests. And now, Davor, you have the floor to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Theodoros. Dear colleagues, we've heard all the different positions. It's not my task to offer a conclusion, but rather to, well, invite you to participate at the debate later on at the plenary, and you will have all the members the opportunity to make clear your views by casting your vote on the resolution prepared by the rapporteur, Mr. Hajdukovic. Let me also take the opportunity to thank all the experts, to acknowledge and thank the presence of our Secretary General, of course, the support of the Secretariat. Let me thank the two chairs of the Monitoring and Migration Committee and ask the members of the Migration Committee to remain and all the others to leave this room. For the members of the Legal Committee to take their nameplates and move to room number 10, where we will continue with the Legal Committee meeting. Thank you very much. This hearing is closed.